The siren screamed through the golden quiet of a California afternoon as Rookie Officer Ethan Cole slammed his cruiser to a stop in the middle of an empty 4-lane highway. His chest heaved, hands shaking slightly around the steering wheel. It was his 3rd month on duty, 3 months of trying to prove that he was worthy of the badge his late father once wore. His father had died in uniform, shot during a traffic stop gone wrong, and ever since that funeral, Ethan had promised himself that he would never hesitate to act. Never freeze. Never fail. And yet, as the sunlight hit the chrome reflection of the Harley he'd just pulled over, his stomach turned with a sense that something about this stop wasn't ordinary. The man standing beside the bike wasn't panicking. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defensive. He was calm, too calm. A mountain of muscle and weathered tattoos, wearing a black leather vest with the words "Hell's Angels" stitched across the front. He had gray in his beard, a stillness in his eyes that spoke of battles survived and regrets buried deep. His wrists were now locked in Ethan's handcuffs, and yet his gaze remained steady, sorrowful almost, as though he pitied the young man who'd just cuffed him. Ethan's radio crackled faintly in the background, the world oddly muted as a gentle wind rustled the American flag hanging from a distant gas station sign. Somewhere deep down, he knew something wasn't right. This wasn't the man they were looking for. The suspect had fled hours ago, last seen wearing a vest like this one. But Ethan's instincts, clouded by fear and the need to prove himself, had taken control. He thought he was doing what a good cop would do. Instead, he had just arrested the wrong man. If you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, because what happens next will remind you how one mistake can change everything. The biker's name was Ray Dalton, though the patch on his vest read, RL.CHLLS. For 20 years, he had ridden with the Angels, not because of violence or rebellion, but because it was the only family he had left. A combat veteran who'd lost both his brothers in the line of fire overseas, Ray came home to find an America that had moved on without him. The road became his therapy, the club his brothers, and his motorcycle his only prayer. And now, standing there with steel cutting into his wrists, he watched this young officer, this trembling kid barely older than his own son would have been, trying to hold himself together under the weight of authority. Ethan led him toward the cruiser, reading him his rights in a voice that cracked despite his effort to sound confident. Around them, the world looked too peaceful for what was happening: clear skies, polished asphalt, birds crossing overhead. A few curious drivers slowed down, phones raised, recording. Ethan hated that. The flashing lights made it look like a victory, but it felt like a mistake he didn't know how to undo. When Ray didn't resist, Ethan's chest tightened even more. Why isn't he angry, he thought. Why isn't he saying anything? But before Ethan could process the quiet dignity of the men he'd cuffed, a low distant hum began to ripple through the still air. It started like a vibration underfoot, then became thunder. Dozens, then hundreds, of motorcycles appeared over the horizon, black dots that grew larger and louder with every passing second. Ethan turned, frozen. The air filled with the growl of engines, the sunlight flashing off chrome, the steady, synchronized roar of 100 machines moving as one. They weren't speeding, they were approaching like a wall of resolve. In less than a minute, the road was filled end to end with Hell's Angels, parking their bikes in perfect formation behind Ray. The sound of engines idling together became a living heartbeat. Ray's eyes softened. They came for me, he whispered, not as a boast, but as a realization that loyalty ran deeper than law. Ethan felt his knees weaken as every biker stared silently in his direction. He wasn't facing criminals. He was facing a brotherhood built on code, pain, and memory, a code he had just broken without knowing. For the first time since his father's death, Ethan felt small. Not weak, but human. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavier than the gun at his hip. He thought about his father, how the old man had once said, "Courage isn't in the arrest, son. It's in knowing when to let go." But now Ethan's fear was louder than his father's voice. He reached for his radio to call for backup, but before he could speak, Ray lifted his cuffed hands slightly and said, in a tone calm enough to break a heart, "It's okay, kid. We all make mistakes." Ethan blinked hard, his breath catching in his throat. There was no hostility in those words, just truth. The veteran biker stood still while the sea of leather and chrome waited behind him. The rookies at dispatch kept asking for updates, but Ethan couldn't find words. He just stood there, the sun glaring off the silver cuffs that bound an innocent man. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. With trembling fingers, he reached down and unlocked the handcuffs. They clicked open with a sound that felt like redemption. Ray didn't smile. He just nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement between two men who understood pain in different ways. Then, turning to the rows of bikers, Ray raised a single hand, and one by one, the engines fell silent. The road went still again, sunlight painting everything gold. The quiet that followed was heavier than thunder. Ethan felt his throat tighten as Ray looked back one last time, his gaze filled not with anger but with something even harder to face, understanding. Then he walked toward his bike, mounted it with effortless grace, and started the engine. The rest of the angels followed, engines revving to life in a rolling symphony of defiance and brotherhood. As the wall of motorcycles disappeared down the highway, Ethan stood motionless beside his cruiser, the wind lifting the dust off the road. He unclipped his radio, turned it off, and sank to his knees, hands buried in his hair. He wasn't crying out of fear anymore. He was crying because, for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly see someone beyond a label, beyond the badge, beyond the leather, beyond the noise. He stayed there until the road grew quiet again. The sky remained bright, the world unchanged, but something deep inside him had been reborn. From that day forward, every stop, every decision, every uniformed hour carried the echo of that moment, the mistake that taught him compassion. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, where every story reminds us that empathy can rewrite even the hardest chapters. And before we end, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Ethan's place? Because as the sun dipped lower over the highway that day, a rookie cop watched 100 bikes ride away,